This is a key to topic 29, worksheet 2. And you can't see that very well, but it says for each of the following, indicate the domain and range. And you want to write the domain and range in interval notation. Okay, so if you look at number 1, so you're given functions in all of these. All of these are functions, and you want to find the domain and range. Now remember, the domain is a set of x coordinates, and the range is a set of y coordinates. And so let's talk about the domain in number 1. So when talking about the domain, the best thing to do is kind of use a ruler and always go from left to right, from smallest to largest along the x-axis. Okay, so you see you have arrows down here, so you have to imagine that this keeps going this way, and then this keeps going this way. Okay, all right, so as you go from left to right, notice I'm going from, so you have arrows here, keep that in mind, those are arrows. So you're going from negative infinity all the way to positive infinity. So what that means is that every point on this graph, my x coordinates will be any real number. So if you look at this point here, that x coordinate's negative, this x coordinate's negative, this x coordinate's negative, and so on. And then I get this x coordinate right here negative, and then I get these x coordinates right here to be positive. But you're going from negative infinity all the way to positive infinity. All right. So you got to look at that in terms of using a ruler or something to help you imagine what's happening. So every x coordinate, every real number for x will be on this graph. As you go, you get any real number for x. Okay. So my domain here will be negative infinity to infinity. So remember, when you're looking at infinity, negative infinity, it's always parentheses. Always use parentheses. The range is a set of y coordinates. So when doing that, you go along the y-axis from bottom up, from smallest to largest, right? So notice this y value here is -2. This y value is a +6. So the numbers down here are smaller than the numbers up there. So you go from the smallest to largest. Okay, so you got to think, just like we did negative infinity to positive infinity, you're going to do the same thing. So notice that these are arrows pointing down, right? So it's kind of like you're pushing this ruler all the way to negative infinity. So I'm going from negative infinity all the way, and then notice that the graph stops here. That's the maximum point, right? Right here, that's maximum point. So I'm going from negative infinity. This is where the graph stops. So you gotta look at that y value. So that y value right here is 4. That's 4. So my range will be negative infinity to 4 with a bracket, because this point right here is on the graph. So 4, the y value 4 is in the domain. Okay, when you look at number 2, notice in number 2 there's an arrow and an open circle. All right, so notice there's not 2 arrows here like there was here. There's an arrow and an open circle. So let's talk about the domain first. So the domain, you go along the x-axis. So the domain is a set of x coordinates. So when I go along the x-axis, notice this arrow. There's an arrow here. So just kind of think of it as keep going this way. So these x values here, I'm going from negative infinity all the way. And then notice that when I go along the x-axis, my ruler stops here because that's where the graph stops, right? So I'm going from negative infinity all the way. Remember, domain's x's, all the way to this. This is where it stops. You got to determine what that x coordinate is right here. So that x coordinate is, you can't see it very well, but that's a 6. So that's a 6. But it's open. So this point is not on the graph. It's an open point. Okay? So that point is not on the graph because it's open. So when you write the domain, you're going to say negative infinity to 6 with parentheses. Parentheses because it's open. Okay? All right, now let's talk about the range. The range you're going from bottom up along the y-axis. Notice this arrow, so think of this arrow as pushing this ruler down. So you're going from negative infinity, keep on going, and then you stop here because that's where that's the highest point of the graph, right? So that's 7. That y value is 7. Notice there's no open circle here, so 7, the y value 7 is in the range. So I'm going to say negative infinity to 7 with a bracket. So you need to make sure you understand when to use brackets and when to use parentheses. Okay, now in this one, there are no arrows, right? No arrows. You have an open circle and a closed circle. So let's talk about the domain. So the domain is a set of x coordinates. Notice when I go along the x-axis, this is where I start. No arrows, so this is where I start. So that x coordinate is negative 5. Open circle, right? So the domain here will be parentheses negative 5, parentheses because of that open circle. All the way, and then we go along the x-axis, you're going to stop here. You're going to stop here. That's a closed circle, so you got to determine that y value. That y value right here is 5. So 5 with a bracket because of the closed circle. That point is on the graph. So my domain will be any real number, see any point here, when we look at any point here, the x coordinates will lie between negative 5 and 5. Okay? Open, close, parentheses, bracket. The range go along the y-axis this time. So when I go along the y-axis, this is where I start. So you got to look at that y value because the ranges are the y coordinates. So what is that y coordinate here? Well, that y coordinate is negative 2. Closed circle, so you're going to use bracket. All the way, so you're looking at all these y coordinates. So all these y coordinates will be any number between negative 2 and 6. But there's an open, so this point's not on the graph, but that y value is 6, but you're going to use parentheses this time because it's open circle. Open, parentheses, closed, bracket. Okay, now let's look at number 4. Number 4 is the same idea as this one, except this one, the parabola pointed down, and in this one, the parabola points up. So same idea. So just think of these arrows are going this way, right? And then think of these as going this way. So for the domain, you're going along the x-axis. So when I go along the x-axis, remember, keep going up, right? So you're going from negative infinity all the way to positive infinity. So if you look at any point in that graph, remember it keeps on going, any point in that graph, my x coordinate will be any real number, so negative infinity to infinity. And whenever you do infinity, negative infinity, it's always parentheses. And always go from smallest to largest. Don't say infinity, negative infinity, that's incorrect. When you write something in an interval, you must go from smallest to largest. Negative infinity to infinity. The range, you go along the y-axis. So when I go along the y-axis, this is where I start, right? So that y value is negative 2. There's no open circle, so I'm going to use bracket. So bracket, negative 2, comma, and then you don't stop at all, right? Because the arrow says you keep on going up. So you're going from y equal negative 2 and all the way to infinity. So my y values that's going to be on this graph, the y values will be any number between negative 2 and positive infinity. Okay, that was number 4. All right, let's look at number 5. So in number 5, you have this graph. You have an open circle, closed circle. So let's talk about the domain. I'm going to put the domain up here. Let's talk about the domain. So the domain, remember, you go from along the x-axis. So when I go along the x-axis, this is where I start the graph. There are no arrows here. No arrows. So since there are no arrows, you're not going to have any infinities, right? Just like number 3. Notice there were no any infinities, negative infinities at all. When you have arrows, that's where you're going to see some infinity symbols or negative infinity. See? You have an arrow here, you see a negative infinity. All right, so no arrows. You're not putting any infinity, negative infinity. So let's go about the domain. So when I talk about the domain, the set of x coordinates, you're going to go from left to right. I start touching the graph here. That's an open circle, though. Keep that in mind. My x value is -5. So I'll go parentheses -5, parentheses because of the open circle. That's not part of that point's not on the graph. That point's not in the domain, or the x value is not in the domain. So that's why I put parentheses all the way to, and then it stops here, right? And that x coordinate right here is a 6. That's a 6. So 6 with a bracket. And then we talk about the range. When you talk about the range, you're going along the along the y-axis. So when I go along the y-axis, this is where I start, right? That's where I start, and this is where I end, or I stop right here, correct? And so my y values, if I look at any point on this graph, my y values will be between -3 and that is a 7. Notice closed circle, and there's no open circle here, so we're going to use brackets in both cases. So range will be from -3 bracket to 7 bracket. Okay, number 6, notice an arrow. All right, so let's look at the domain. So the domain in number 6, you go from left to right. So when I go from left to right, this is where I start. There's an open circle. So that's -7. So I'm going to put parentheses -7 all the way. And then remember, it keeps on going, right? It's because of the arrow. So infinity. Okay, now let's look at the range. The range set of y coordinates. So think of this as pushing it down. So you're going from -infinity all the way to, and then this is where the graph stops. So that's at a 7, right? So the range, -infinity to 7. But remember, you got to make sure you put the bracket or parentheses correctly. Since that's an open circle, 7 is not going to be in the range. So you're going to put a parentheses. Number 7, see an arrow, but you also see a open circle. So the domain, we put the domain here. The domain, you're going from parentheses, and that x coordinate's -5. So you go from -5 all the way. See an arrow so it keeps on going, right? All the way to infinity. So parentheses -5, comma, infinity, parentheses. The range, you go along the y-axis this time. So this is where you start. And notice the arrow keep on going up, right? Keep on going up. So this y value here is -2, bracket, comma, and then keeps on going. So that's infinity. Remember, infinity, -infinity, you're always going to put parentheses with it. In number 8, you have arrows on both sides. So let's talk about the domain. So remember, the arrow keeps on going and keeps on going this way. So you're going from -infinity all the way to, it never stops, right? All the way to positive infinity. So if you look at all these x, if you look at every point, the x coordinates, the x values will be from -infinity all the way to positive infinity. Parentheses on both. The range, same thing, right? So keeps on going down. So my range will, if you look at all these y values here, all these y values, the range will be from -infinity all the way to positive infinity. -infinity to positive infinity. So that's number 8. Okay, and then number 9, notice you have closed circles on both ends, so no arrows. So let's talk about the domain. All right, domain, this is where you start. You go along the x-axis for the domain, so this is where you start. This x coordinate is -7. So bracket -7 all the way, and then this is where you stop right here. That's a 5 with a bracket. So my x coordinates will be any real number between -7 and 5. So if you look at any point on that graph, and you look at all these x coordinates will be from -7 to 5. The range, so if you look at the y values, the range, this is where you start when you go along the y-axis. That's that y coordinate of -3. Remember, they're closed circles, so that's why you see brackets. All the way to, and then this is where it stops, and that y-coordinate is 6 with a bracket. Okay, now number 10, the last one, you see an open circle and you see an arrow. So let's talk about the domain. The domain, when you go from left to right, this is where you start, an open circle though, so that x-coordinate and that y-coordinate will not be in the domain and range. But the x-coordinate here is -7. Yep, -7, so it'll be parentheses, -7, comma, and then notice it never stops because this arrow keeps on going, right? So when you look at every point on that graph, the x-coordinate will be from -7 all the way to infinity. The range, okay, so the range, remember you have an arrow here, so the range you're going, so you look at the y values. So if you pick any point, let's say down here, that y value, remember it keeps on going, so you go from -infinity all the way, and then this is where it stops, right here, right? So that y value is 7. So you go from -infinity to 7 with a bracket because this point, the y value here of 7 is in the range. There's no open circle. This is the only open circle you see. So that's why you see the domain with -7 with parentheses. All right, and so that is the key to the worksheet number 2 on topic 29. Now that's where you had to find domain and range from graphs.